have you noticed that you don't really see games about negotiating? I mean, combat, farming, building, investigating, talking, collecting cards and haggling, those are all small side mechanics in big games. And over time, we managed to develop them in fully fledged standalone games. We have perfected those small mechanics and turned them into entire systems. All of them. Almost. Except for one. Why is that? Really quick, this video is an extended version of the extra credits video on the same topic that I helped write. There will be more details and examples in this video, but if you just want a quick summary of this, go watch the extra credits video. After you're done watching this one, of course, because algorithm. So, what kind of food you're ordering tonight, whether or not you are in electrical or debating which hero you want to pick in Valorant. These are all negotiations with other people, and they are everywhere around us in our daily lives. Negotiations are a basic means of getting what you want from others. It's a back and forth communication designed to reach an agreement when you and the other side have some interests that are shared and others that are opposed. This is the definition from this book. And I know, very cliche to start a video with a quote, but this book will be relevant a little bit later in the video. So a subset of negotiation is haggling, which specifically focuses on dealing with money, going back and forth on the price of something. It's that thing people used to do before online algorithms became a thing, and it's sadly kind of a lost tradition at this point. If you Google games about haggling, you'll stumble upon mostly tabletop games like Catan, Basari or Chinatown, where you get to haggle over resources with other players. And that right there is the key reason why we don't often see haggling in video games. Other players. Haggling seems to be an activity that relies heavily on a human being on the other side of the conversation, and that's not something easy to digitize, at least not before machine learning was a thing. So because of that, early haggling in video games was mostly seen in MMOs as a form of trading between real players in a designated marketplace area or through an auction house. When it comes to gamifying haggling, and god I hate that word, it's rather difficult to design around it in a single player game. It could purely be a mechanic like selling something to a vendor and then buying it back at a lower price, but the actual act of haggling was never the main focus of gameplay. It was merely a side mechanic you engage in before getting back to the real gameplay. Gwent. Now, the solution to this problem is simple in theory, but very difficult in practice. We simply have to formalize haggling. That means making the act of haggling itself inherently engaging, rather than relying on the external reward of the end goal. So the question becomes, how the hell do you make haggling engaging in a single player game? And the first answer to that is capitalism. There have been some novel approaches to formalizing haggling in certain games. One example being the time-based reaction minigame of Potion Craft, similar to the reloading mechanic in Gears of War, and another approach would be the trial and error process of discovering customer reactions in Moonlighter, which happens to be the game inspired by what is still considered to be the golden standard of haggling games. Released in 2007 in Japan and developed by a fairly small team, Reciteer puts you in the shoes of a young orphan girl confronted by the Depth Fairy and forced to run an item shop so she can pay off the debt her father accumulated before mysteriously disappearing. I know, Japan. So Reciteer kind of invented and popularized the shopkeeping genre that is at the core of games like Holy Potatoes, Shoppy Keeper, Dealer's Life and many others. The gameplay is basically split into two halves. You team up with local heroes to go dungeon crawling and loot precious items, after which you return to your shop where you put those items up for sale and you start haggling with customers. The way haggling works is a customer walks up to you with an item and asks how much. You are then required to input a price, and the game gives you a frame of reference of what's the item's base price and a general recommendation of asking for 30% more. The customer can either accept that or claim that it's too expensive, at which point you are asked to input another price. This is basically a money-themed tug-of-war, where each side takes a position, anchors it, and makes arguments to move the needle towards their position. This also means that the other person and their position becomes the problem. This is defined as positional bargaining, and we're not done with the book yet. It's pretty much what we're used to interact with in most games. A little UI representing the tug-of-war, where we get to name a price and hope for the best. It's basically the same mechanical depth as the volume slider on this video. Positional bargaining, by definition, is a zero-sum game, a commonly used term in game design describing a situation where one side wins at the cost of the other side losing. But it's not the end of the world. As a designer, you can make good use of positional bargaining by taking into consideration the two flavors it comes in. When it comes to positional bargaining, there is hard and soft bargaining. The hard type is the kind of haggling you do with a stranger or an adversary, someone you don't really know or trust. With little to no empathy involved, you make threats. You're hard on the problem and the people. You demand one-sided gains as the price for an agreement. This is the kind of haggling encouraged when you're in a position of power. Like in Disco Elysium, when the manager asks you to pay your hotel damages. If you have high authority, you can threaten him and bring that price down significantly. This also involves talking to your own Thai, and it's not a Japanese game, I checked. The soft type of haggling takes relationships into consideration. It's something you do with a friend, someone you trust and value their relationship. Empathy plays a big role in this one, where you make offers and you're easy on the people. You accept one-sided losses in order to reach an agreement. After many efforts, I managed to get in touch with Muracha, the designer of Recettear, and he said that one of the most important aspects of haggling in games is making the player think about the negotiation partner. And it's important to decide what information to show to the player and what not. A very interesting example of this is the game No Umbrellas Allowed, encouraging you to tackle haggling from different angles. It does this by asking you to pay attention to certain details like the quality of an item, what year it was manufactured in, and what material it is made out of in order to assess its value. All of this while taking your relationship with the customer into consideration as well.
First, when it comes to appraising things, I use cards. Oh!
Since hard positional bargaining dominates the soft kind and is also easier to implement in a game, most examples out there kind of reflect that. Going for the hard bargaining tug-of-war is kind of the easy way out, so let's shift the discussion towards another example of soft bargaining.
Where Racketeer was able to really nail down sort of the core idea of, hey, try to raise the price as much as you can to sell so you can make the most money. We inserted sort of more of how do you talk about something?
This is Aryo, the designer of Potionomics, a game all about soft bargaining. You play as a young potion maker trying to sell your potions to curious customers, and you do so by engaging in the act of haggling throughout the use of cards.
Over the course of haggling, you draw cards that represent different ideas of how to haggle.
Your goal is to increase the customer's interest in order to close the deal at a good price before they run out of patience. Now, each customer responds differently to different types of haggling, and the beauty of it is the amount of variety you have in your approach.
I think the core the idea is that haggling is sort of coming up with ways on the spot to sort of convince somebody to buy your product. And that sense of things coming to your mind actually ended up being super important to us as a haggling card game. The idea that you're coming up with things on the spot and trying to convince them, essentially, right?
And that focus on player agency, reinforced by the different types of haggling cards, is pretty much the core design of Potionomics. So let's take a look at how variety and other mechanical alterations can be used to inject more depth in haggling gameplay. I have identified a few different ways of spicing things up when designing a haggling interaction, starting with giving the player various ways to tackle the same problem. Games like Kingdom Come basically give you a binary option of either increasing or decreasing your price, while on the other hand you have Potionomics that leans more into player agency. Aside from selling potions to generic customers, you'll also have other merchants stopping by your shop every now and then.
But the way that you actually get more techniques in the game is by just hanging out with essentially other shopkeepers and vendors in the world as friends and basically picking up on sort of how they like to haggle with their customers.
You can learn more aggressive selling tactics by hanging out with a moody weirdo, or you can focus on stress management with a forest lady. In terms of approach variety, Recettear also swaps roles and asks you to buy from other merchants, putting you in the shoes of the customer. These different ways of approaching haggling also creates a sense of progression, keeping the interaction from getting stale, because selling something expensive should feel different from selling something cheap. Another way of adding depth is by introducing a time pressure element. Setting your anchor too high can only happen so many times before the customer gets frustrated and storms out. This means that you lost your opportunity to close the deal with that customer, but in other games you also lose reputation in the process. In Griftlands, the time pressure comes from the enemy's arguments getting stronger over time, and in Potionomics you have to not only worry about the customer's patience, but manage your own stress levels that build up over time if you don't handle your arguments properly. When it comes to single-player games, the quality of your interaction is directly linked to how much thought was put in the customer AI. Expectations, budgets, and reactions are some of the variables you can tweak for each customer to create variety, but this can be pushed even further with behavior.
But every character actually has their own personality. And so you kind of have to deal with those traits when, as sort of the shopkeeper, as when you're having with them. Like, are they more reserved than other customers? You know, do you have to crack them open a little bit? Is this customer just like constantly talking? Like, you know, those customers that like just constantly talking. And maybe it might know you, or you can't get like a word in or something like that.
How about a haggling game where customers are receptive to different players' behavior? Like replying to them quickly would make them more susceptible to spending more money, or maybe offering a customer a free item would make them more interested in what else you have to offer. Just whatever you do, don't fall into the same trap I've fallen into by looking at the Pawn Stars game in the hopes of finding a good example of haggling. They make you watch an ad in order to increase the customer's patience. Top quality design. Instead, take inspiration from Griftlands, where your actions are reflected on the characters around you, because killing someone will make their friends hate you, which might lead to some lost opportunities down the line. Pushing further on the topic of customer behavior, we dive into managing relationships, which is the core part of soft positional bargaining. On the surface level, it can be as easy as gifting gold to a merchant in Divinity Original Sin in order to gain their trust and get better prices later on. But getting to know your customer as an additional goal to making a profit leads to more engaging decisions during negotiations. In Recettear, the same hero that helps you out during the dungeon crawling part of the game shows up as a customer. And now you're faced with a decision of either upselling him to make a quick buck or giving him a discount, knowing that the gear you're selling him will actually benefit you as well during the dungeon crawling. Managing relationships within the context of negotiations asks the player to make a decision between short-term profits or potentially long-term unknown goals. In Potionomics, the more time you spend interacting with the other merchants, the more opportunities you can unlock, both in terms of haggling cards, but also as additional narrative and mechanical rewards that you can use to spice up your shop. Additionally, you can take this into a morally questionable direction similar to Papers, Please, where some citizens directly ask you for help at the cost of your own well-being. Another great example of this from No Umbrellas Allowed is when someone shows up in your shop and says, "I'd like to ask you for a favor. A man is going to show up with a statue sometime today and he's going to insist about checking its materials. Please tell him it's 24 karat gold. My life depends on it." What would you do in that situation? This is the beauty of using soft bargaining to ethically challenge the player. Even though it's technically difficult, I would love to see more games embrace the idea of customer tales. Haggling in person relies a lot on reading body language and figuring out where the other person stands in terms of the price. LA Noire took a good shot at this with some pretty impressive technology, but fell short due to direction, acting, and a bunch of other limitations. Deus Ex took a purely mechanical approach to this problem by allowing you to augment your perception and get a readout of the social situation throughout a new piece of UI. Rewarding the player for paying attention to small details can be an incredibly useful tool, and customer tales don't have to be strictly about expressions, but it could be something like the soundtrack revealing a new subtle instrument layer whenever you're doing something right. Or maybe in the UI, holding down the arrow to increase the price does so at a steady pace, but what if those increments slow down very subtly when you're closer to what the customer is willing to pay? What if your money pouch is actually physics-based? There are a lot of ways of injecting this concept in gameplay systems. And finally, depth can be also added throughout external factors outside of haggling. The supply and demand can be affected by events, such as rainy days, increasing the demand for umbrella. Okay, maybe not that one. But customizing your shop can influence the type of customers you attract, as well as the items you place in your window displays. In Battle Brothers, if you fail to clear up the bandits, supply goes down, so you can sell your stuff at a higher price. Not ethical, but convenient. So we talked a lot about pushing positional bargaining as far as it goes from a game design perspective. By nature, it's a zero-sum situation, but what if I tell you there is another way to negotiate? A better way, one that can actually lead to a win-win situation. With the focus of positional bargaining being on positions, our beloved reoccurring book introduces a new way of negotiating, called principled bargaining. It does away with positions and instead focuses on interests. Here is a practical example. Two people are hanging out in the same room. One of them wants the window open while the other one wants it closed. The old positional tug-of-war approach would be presenting you with a slider where you get to suggest how much the window is open or closed in order to reach a middle ground. Just like that tug-of-war we talked about earlier. However, the new principled bargaining approach is to dig deeper and finding out the intentions of each person. Turns out that one of them just wants fresh air while the other one wants to avoid the draft. So in this case, the solution is to open a window in the next room, satisfying both of them at the same time without anyone losing. This option would probably never be considered with the previous positional bargaining approach. And in this case, the other person is the ally, not the enemy, and the problem becomes the goal. The core idea is identifying each party's intentions and coming up with options for mutual gain. This seems to be an outright superior approach to negotiations and, sadly, also the reason why it's incredibly difficult to implement in a game. Given its non-binary outcomes and potential heavy reliance on writing, this ends up being a much more costly and difficult mechanic to properly translate into gameplay.
Another satisfied customer. Good day.
Games like Griftlands are a very good step in the right direction, specifically by how it managed to turn negotiations into gameplay without going overboard with the writing. I have also noticed a type of principled bargaining in a few sports management games like Out of the Park, where in the process of negotiating a contract with a new player, you don't simply move a slider to determine their value, but you get to tweak different aspects of the offer, like contract type, term duration, and a bunch of various other clauses. The reality of it is all of these variables have an invisible value to them, and it's up to you as the designer to determine how much you reveal to the player. And even if you nail down principled bargaining in your game, there are also some interesting unanswered questions like how do you account for negotiating with a scammer or with an altruistic or hostile customer? How do you even design an endgame for a haggling mechanic? Or could you introduce haggling in the context of microtransactions, dealing with real-world money? There actually is a Nintendo game that did this, surprisingly. You know what would help answer those questions? An actual discussion in the comments below. If you have any thoughts on haggling in games, drop a comment. Another viewer will very likely see your comment and it might encourage them to respond, and before you know it, we'll be sharing tidbits of information we didn't know before, having a proper conversation like adults, which actually helps me make these videos even better. I'm actually excited to bring this up in a video and shed some light on this concept in the hopes that I spark some interests, and maybe 3 years from now when you're thinking about adding haggling in your own game, you'll remember this video and reference it for more research. As you've noticed with previous videos I made, this is not exactly a topic that a lot of people talk about, so it's very difficult to do research and find good examples to showcase. And it definitely doesn't help that the mechanic of haggling isn't exactly mainstream either. So compared to how many games are out there focused on combat, dialogue, or puzzle solving right now, haggling is a severely unexplored design concept. And as a designer myself, I find that very exciting because in today's world where player behavior is closely analyzed and everything is data-driven, where mechanics are exploited and standardized across franchises and tens of games are being released every single day, it's a rare thing to be able to say that a mechanic is underexplored. So I'm hoping this video will act as a call to action in the pursuit of pushing the design of haggling further. And on that note, I'll leave you with one final quote from Aryo.
I think the haggling mechanic is very under investigated. If there's any like vein of, precious gold that still exists in new design in games, I think that's where we should be heading.